Another quick update on these rear guards for the car. I think we've seen the rear one before. I don't think I had it sitting in the right place last time, so that's actually set up the correct sort of height above the tyre. It's a bit hard to see. They are going to be very chunky. I have been working on doing the front ones, and as you can see, these are quite long, but they're actually fairly straight. There's not a lot of shape in them. So they are going to sweep pretty much all the way down to the back near the rear guards, and there's a little kick up on the tail there. So all I've done is I had to cut these into two sections and then weld them together, and I've gone ahead and wired the edge. I'm actually getting a lot better at doing that now, so my technique is improving, I think. I make the brake line in the bead rollers, which are down there at the moment. Really need to make a stand for those things, and half the other tools I've got. The problem is space. I'm sort of running out of space a little bit. But I bend the flange up on the edge to 90 degrees, and then I wrap the steel over the wire. Now the wire I'm using is it's fencing wire. This being New Zealand, this is actually number 8 fencing wire. It's 4mm steel wire, galvanized. This is quite easy to get. You can get this from a lot of hardware shops and places like that. And I found the best way to cut it is with a decent set of sort of bolt cutters, and I ended up buying these Knipex brand ones, which I'd read quite a few reviews online about, and they're just really good. I did look at buying a bigger set of bolt cutters, and then I decided, well, anything bigger I can use an angle grinder and a cut-off wheel or a hacksaw. And for doing wire and doing the sort of car stuff I want to do, these are a lot more useful, I think. A lot smaller, easier to store. So they weren't cheap, but they seem very good, and they'll cut through this stuff pretty easily. So I trim the wire, and then you have to straighten it because it comes off a coil, so it's all curved. I just usually run it a couple of times through the slip rollers here, which actually have a groove built in for doing that kind of thing, and I can just sort of run the wire through there and manipulate it and get it fairly straight. This is another tool that I really need to find a better place for. But when I made these ones, I actually forgot to wrap the wire, wrap the flange around the wire, and I ended up putting in the radius on the edge first. And then I thought, well, that's going to make it difficult to do the wiring, but actually it was pretty easy. I just did it the normal way, where you use the vice grips to hold the wire in place against the flange. You use a couple of those either side, and then you start hammering the wire over enough just to lock it into place. And then I found what I could do was use my comma dolly, which conveniently fits over the top of the curve, and I have been hammering it from this side, sliding the hammer on the table and just moving the hammer and dolly along to tighten up the fold, and that's actually working really well for me. So it still needs a little bit of work, but I do get a nice wide edge on it. So the next thing to do on these will be make the top pieces. That's just a rectangular strip with the edge bent over. It shouldn't be too difficult because, like I say, there isn't much shape in this, so it's not going to need much shrinking. Just a little tiny bit at the end here, and then a little bit at the bottom, and then I can start welding this together. And then I'll put this on the car lined up with blocks and clamps and however I can make it fit, and see what they look like. I will probably roll the car outside to do that, because you really need to be able to step away from it and step around it to see what it looks like. The other thing I've been doing is cleaning up the Riley parts. So it turns out the clutch I had, the one I was going to use, wasn't the right one. It was actually a 6-cylinder one. So I have ordered the correct bearing, thrust bearing, to go in there. Those are horribly expensive, about 300 and something New Zealand dollars. And I do need to get a nut, although I may look at making that. I need to set up my lathe for thread cutting, and I'll get into that in a second, but this is stuck in place. There we go. I did finish cleaning up the flywheel, which has come up really well. There's a little bit of rust pitting on it, but I think it'll be fine. I do need the bearing that goes in the end here for the gearbox input shaft. So there's some sort of bearing that goes in there. That's on order from the Riley spares. And the rest of this should all clean up nicely. The clutch is, the driven plate is off being relined for me by the local brake and clutch place. And hopefully when the parts from the UK arrive, I can then go off and get all the rotating assembly balanced. Then I can start reassembling the engine. The other thing that's happened is I think I've been watching too many of the Soltoni videos, because I really felt the urge to go out and buy a mill. So basically I did. It sort of coincided with Ian visiting, and he'd mentioned mills as well, so a couple of mentions coming up in the same week, I thought, oh, what the hell, I might as well spend a bit of money and get one. So it's just one of the Metal Master ones. It's belt drive, but it was within my budget, and it should be okay for everything I need to do. It seems like a fairly good sort of machine. It is quite big. I had to work from home one day last week while they were delivering it, and then work out how to first assemble the stand there, and then two, get it up onto it, which wasn't easy because I think it weighs between 250 300 kg. What I ended up doing was stripping it down, taking it apart, which was good because I was able to clean it all up, get the packing grease off it and re-grease it all. And I sort of broke it down into 3 sections. So the whole top section, the head here, comes off. You can lift that off. And then I unbolted the column there, which is shimmed to the base, so you have to be very careful you keep the shims in the exact right place. And then the base there, when it arrived, it was sitting on a pallet, of course, so it was on the ground. It was fairly easy, and I just used my little engine lifting platform thing there and the 1-ton chain hoist, and I was able to lift it up, get it onto here by myself. To get the head back on, you can see I had to put the chain hoist around one of the beams in the ceiling to get enough height to lift that into place. Luckily I managed to do it with no accidents. I was being very careful, of course, because I was working by myself, so I was pleased when it all went back together and it all worked again. I've already started modifying it. It came with a safety screen, which bolts on there, and I think my camera battery is about to die, so I might stop this and recharge it, and then I'll come back. Okay, the battery's had enough charge, hopefully, so I can just finish this. As I was saying, the mill did come with this safety screen. It's got a micro switch in it so that it won't turn on unless the cover is in place. It sort of rotates. It's kind of hard to see. I removed all that because maybe a screen like this will help someone who's a complete idiot from sticking their hand into the rotating parts of the machine. But for those of us who aren't complete morons, they tend to make things worse because they just get in the way. You can't see what's happening, you can't see where the tool's going. Over time they just get scratched up and grubby and horrible, and it just makes it worse. So for me, not being an idiot, I find these actually make things less safe. So I just took that off, which probably voids the warranty, but we can always put that back if we need to. The other thing I've done is, from Bunnings, I got this cheap, and I mean really cheap, it was like $6 lamp, which I took apart, and I had an old cable lying around with a switch on it. So I just sort of mounted that to the bracket that the screen was mounted to, and it just gives me some extra light in there. It's got a LED bulb in there so it doesn't get hot. Now, the machine did come, it was like a package deal. I think they're trying to get rid of these ones. They're going now to the more gearhead ones. It did come with various bits and pieces. So there was a horrible vise, which is probably good enough for drilling. I wouldn't want to try milling anything in it though. It is adjustable. It's got these angle adjustments. There is a chuck, which is good because it actually goes up to 16 millimeters, which is quite handy. There's a collet set. So there's an ER32 collet. There are some end mills. There's the little taper bar, which seems to be made out of really soft metal, because the first time I used it I just put dings all through it. So I'll probably have to make another one of those. And yeah, it seems like a fairly good machine. I've not used a mill a lot. I've used them a few times, a couple of times. I'm hardly an expert. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm sort of figuring it out as I go along. I've already broken one of the cutters because one of the things I wanted to do is square up the ends of this chunk of railway line I've got. The problem is it's quite big and I couldn't support it fully, so I did have it all sort of bolted down in that little vise. I must mention I did actually buy a decent sized, good solid milling vise as well. I thought it was worth getting that, and it definitely has been. But I was trying to mill this just with the end mills, the high-speed steel end mills that came with it, and it was going okay. And then it's just too hard to clamp it down solidly, and it ended up moving and broke one of the flutes off the mill, which was the biggest one, of course. So I've had to rethink how I'm going to do this, and what I've ended up doing, the clamp down kit was part of the package deal actually, and this is really good. This is very handy. But what I've done is I have, on the sides of my railway line, I've welded on a piece of thick wall square tube section, and then what that should let me do is, I'm hoping with the clamp down set, I'll be able to clamp that down very firmly from both sides. Let's start sort of through there, and hopefully I'll probably have to shim it up because the ends aren't square, which is what I'm trying to do. So I'll shim it up so it doesn't rock at all, and then I can use the face cutter to flatten off the ends. I don't need them to be square actually, I just want them to be flat because I use them for hammering against. And it was just too much work to try and do that with the angle grinder and a sanding disc. So I'm hoping this will work. Now, like I say, I'm not an expert. I've not really used a lot of this stuff before, just little bits and pieces, a little tiny bit when I was at school, which was decades ago, a little bit when I was doing the night classes, which was also decades ago now I think about it, and I used the mill at Weta a little bit, but definitely not an expert. So I'm sort of playing around, just figuring it out. I do now understand why those engineer's blocks are useful. I've never really thought about them before. They're steel blocks. They're precision ground steel blocks, sorry, which are 1 inch thick by 2 inches by 3 inches, and they're usually perforated with a bunch of holes so you can bolt them down. And it's for doing things like this. So to set this up, this needs to be higher than the clamping set, so you need something to stand this on. So you use a precision ground block that sits flat on the table, and then you can sit these up on it to lift them up high enough. So they're very, very useful. So obviously I've ordered a set of those. The other thing I've ordered is, this is the fly cutter, the end mill that came with the kit. And I don't know what these tools are made out of. They seem very weird. They look almost like cadmium plated, or not cadmium, like zinc plated. But they are hard and they are cutting, but they don't look like tool steel, so I'm not quite sure what those are. I have played with it a bit, and I have managed to face something off, which seemed to work reasonably well. But I've ordered some carbide insert tooling, mainly because I know I'm going to screw up, and rather than breaking something like this or having this break stuff, I'd rather break inserts because you can easily replace them. So I've got another face cutter, that's what that's called, another face cutter on the way, and some insert end mills as well. Now the reason I've got all this is because what I want to try doing is making up the engine brackets. This is the engine mount and suspension mount for the Riley that kind of goes in underneath that engine mounting there. And the originals were cast. This is one of the original ones, the cast one, but you can't get these anymore. Obviously I've got one, but I need the other side as well as this side. So what I have got is some angle iron, which is about the right thickness. So what I'm going to try and do is make up my own version of these brackets. The steel rod here is for making the part that the suspension shackle bush goes through. But theoretically, now I've got a mill, I should be able to more or less replicate this part, at least make something that's going to work. So that's the plan. It's probably going to take a bit of practice, but luckily I've got plenty of this steel to play with. I think that's about it for now. So I've got multiple things going on. I still do need to figure out how I'm going to do this offside engine mounting bracket, which also incorporates the steering mount. So you can see there I've sort of 3D printed a mock-up so I know what to build. Obviously this part is just a mirror image of the other side. Then you've got the steering mount. This isn't a Brooklands type one. This is off a different sort of Riley, but this should work. I just have to get the positioning correct because the steering box, there isn't much room between the block and the end of the steering box. You also need height from the bottom of the carburetors, and then when the steering box is in there, the drop arm off the steering box has to clear the chassis. In fact, I think this probably needs a tiny little notch cut out of it to clear that, but I'll figure all that out once I get to it. Oh, the other thing I wanted to do is making the nut. So I did 3D print the gear set for the lathe, for the change gears, which would allow me to cut threads. But I do need to make up another little shaft that it runs on, the gears run on, to go in here. And this is keyed. So if we look at one of these gears, let me see, you can see it's got a slot in it. So I need to make a little shaft with a keyway milled in it, and that's one of the things I want to do on the mill. I did also get this little tiny vertical milling slide to go on the lathe, and that just bolts onto the tool post holder, and that's probably actually enough to let me mill that slot. The only reason I haven't done it so far is because I can't find my little milling cutters. I did have some small 3-4 mil cutters, but no idea where they've gone. So until I get some more of those, I can't really do that. Of course, now I've got the mill, I'll probably be doing it on the mill instead. But lots going on. Finish the guards next, I think.